Good morning and welcome to another Streaming Media Connect, Streaming Media West Connect. This is our 6th virtual event, and I think at the beginning of each one, I make a point of saying we're going to be in person next time. Maybe I've jinxed it, so I'm not going to say that, but I am going to say that you can save the date for Streaming Media East in Boston in May 24th. And also look for an announcement soon regarding another Streaming Media Connect virtual event coming up in February. And we'll be launching the call for speakers for both of those events very soon. I'm Eric Schumacher-Rasmussen. I'm the editor and VP of Streaming Media and the conference chair. Welcome. Thanks again for joining us. We've got a great week planned with about 30 sessions, keynotes, panels, presentations. And if you can't make it to all of them, be sure to check them out on demand soon after we wrap things up on Friday. We kick things off this morning with our twice-a-year research keynote looking at the state of the streaming industry. And I'd like to thank Millicast for sponsoring this survey and the upcoming research report. We'll be launching another survey this week on a slightly different topic, so be sure to keep an eye out for that. And also, just for being here, you are all entered into a drawing to win an Amazon gift card. We'll be announcing the winner of the Amazon gift card at the end of the session as well. Before we jump in, just a few housekeeping notes. If you have questions for our speakers, Tim Siglin from the Help Me Stream Research Foundation and Ryan Jespersen from Millicast, or me, please put them in the Q&A tab rather than in the chat. That just makes it a little easier for us to keep track of them. Also, we are running live transcripts, or we should be. If they are running at the bottom of your screen and you wish to get rid of them, you can go to the bottom of your screen, click on live transcript, and click disable transcript. If you have any questions for us, your hosts, you can put those in the chat. But again, if you have any questions for the speakers, please put them in the Q&A. Now, before we jump into our discussion, I'm going to pass things back to our producer for a quick video message from Millicast. Bill, you want to run the Millicast pre-roll?
Millicast is a real-time streaming platform built by WebRTC industry experts. Our unique architecture can cascade live streams to over 1 million concurrent viewers with broadcast quality video and audio and sub-second latency end-to-end across the globe. Our customers include top Hollywood studios, post-production houses, and national broadcasters that require extremely high quality, as well as live auction houses that require extremely low latency. Human nature craves interaction. Millicast is driving innovation with interactivity features that enable a new generation of audience engagement across industries. Gaming, AR and VR, social media, education, e-commerce, virtual tours, health and fitness, and many more. Millicast is built for developers with a simple API and SDKs that make it easy to launch your own interactive streaming solution in a matter of minutes. Choose Millicast and embrace the future of interactive streaming.
And with that, let's ask Ryan Jespersen from Millicast to join us on screen. Ryan, how are you on this early morning out there in the Pacific Northwest?
Hi, Eric. Hi, Tim. Hi, everyone. Yeah, pleasure to join you guys. A little dark here still, but I've got my coffee and ready to jump into to this keynote.
Good. That video kind of summed things up for Millicast, but just describe a little bit about what Millicast does and what you do for Millicast.
Yeah, so I think a lot of you probably know me from many years in the streaming industry. I was at Wowza for 5 years and have been in the industry at large for about 15 or 20 years. So at Millicast, we really have been using WebRTC to kind of usher in this new generation of real-time streaming that has become extremely predominant, especially during the pandemic, where people are trying to get sub-second to really add interactivity. So Zoom's a good example. We're all sitting in Zoom. If you wanted to go and build your own Zoom and have it be web native, you can do that with Millicast and other WebRTC products that are out there in the market. And I think the keynote today, I think, is going to be a great kind of deep dive into how we can do that. I mentioned in that video briefly about just the remote production space is a great example. All these Hollywood studios have had to keep their lights on, right, during the pandemic, and there's a lot of film and TV shows and so on that are moving to these remote first workflows, and all of them are building solutions on WebRTC, and I know we'll dive into that later on.
We will, and let me welcome Tim Siglin, who is a longtime streaming media contributing editor, going on 20-ish years right now, I think, right?
23, yeah.
23,
so,
okay.
Yeah,
I haven't been with streaming media that long. You are now the longest, I think, you and Joel Unico, our publisher, are now the longest running streaming media. You're not staff, but you've been with us since the start.
I was gonna say geezers.
Geezers, yeah, that works too.
And like you know, every time we do this state of streaming survey, this is now our fourth, I say, okay, next time I'll present it to you in person. So anyway, so what do you want to talk about first on this?
Well, real quick, I would like you to talk a little bit about the Help Me Stream Research Foundation and how Help Me Stream is working with organizations like Streaming Media to do research in the online video industry.
Sure. So Help Me Stream is actually a 501c3, which means we're a charitable organization here in the States. We get in really fun things like old Macintoshes. Eric's laughing because he donated this one. And we try to figure out how to take those old technologies, add some of the new sort of best practices, and figure out how to turn those into streaming boxes to send to emerging economies. We're doing classroom in a box, essentially. But as part of that, we also need to look at the baseline of the industry. And so that's one of the nice things about doing these state of streaming surveys is we get a chance to see sort of where the trends are moving. And along with the information today, streamingmedia.com publish those findings out along with sponsors like Millicast.
Very good. And with that, let's jump into the survey. Let me share my screen here. And as both Tim and I have said, this is the fourth state of streaming survey, isn't it, Tim?
It is. In fact, we started out with the idea of doing these one a year, but things have changed so rapidly over the last 2 years that we decided to do one every 6 months. Because as we've sort of ebbed and flowed in the pandemic from lockdowns to not lockdowns back to semi-lockdowns, you know, we've wanted to see how the industry has shifted in that period of time.
Right. And what's interesting is, you know, with that 6-month time frame in between each survey, it seems like this fourth one is the first one where we've really been able to take that step back and see some longitudinal changes. I mean, we've noticed certainly some differences, you know, from spring to autumn each year, but now that we've got the fourth one under our belt, we're seeing some more. And let's just dive in. And I guess what I'd like to ask you to do here, Tim, is to start by talking about the demographics a little bit.
Sure.
And then Ryan and I will chime in to comment. You'll ask us questions, and I'll keep pushing the slides here, provided all the pointers and all the windows on my screen stay where I want them to be.
Sounds good. So as Eric mentioned, you know, given the fact that this is our fourth one, what we like to say when we do analysis, and Michelle, who's principal analyst in Help Me Stream, as well as my wife, we joke about the fact that given her math background, if you see a change on the second or the third survey, is that an anomaly or is it a trend? But now that we've got 4 surveys under our belt for this, we can clearly see some trends. From a demographic standpoint, just briefly, obviously you can see there are a number of industries that are represented here for people who took the survey. Education, if you look on the right-hand side, education sits at 16.6%. When we started these surveys, it was about 4%. The first survey actually came out just before the initial lockdowns in March 2020. Also, the sort of sports book and gambling, that has risen from being nothing in the first few to actually now at least registering on the board. In terms of the people who took the survey, still about 80%, roughly 78% from North America, 20% from Europe, and about 2 to 4% from the rest of the world. Average time in the industry is about 11 years. That stayed constant across all of our last 4 surveys. So what we're getting is groupings of people who are early to the industry, maybe 1 to 5 years, but a number of people who, like me, have been in it for at least 15 years or more. So the responses we get, we feel, are quality responses, because ultimately it's people who've been in the industry for quite some time. Ryan, Eric, I don't know if there's anything you want to add to this particular one. I know, Ryan, you were surprised sort of sportsbook has become a thing in the US after you came back from Europe.
Absolutely. I think the interesting thing, if you guys have followed, iGaming is kind of the term that's being used for this industry. The United States Supreme Court kind of in 2018 paved the way for states to start regulating their own betting and gambling beyond the obvious ones of New Jersey and Las Vegas, with Nevada, I should say, that have owned this space, right, from a state perspective. You're seeing a huge trend now. Like, I came back and I was watching these, the World Series is going on right now, baseball World Series, and I've been watching the football game, American football, and you have all of these, like Fox has its own sports book, right? And all the major broadcasters are all doing their own sports book in association with, Poker Stars or, these different betting organizations. And in Europe, it's been a long time coming. I live in Spain half of the year, and in the UK as well. You have all the major sports books, right? They're all part of the experience. I think in the United States specifically, this is going to create a little bit of a wild west in the next 12 months and beyond. Pretty much overnight, you're going to have a multi-billion-dollar industry that forms out of this, and there's going to be a lot of products built around that, which I think is quite interesting. And then education, I think, is a very obvious trend. With the pandemic, as we talked about, I think education has been one that not just Zoom, but the rest of the education industry has wanted to kind of expand into live streaming and real-time streaming products to kind of cater to the obvious audience that's needed to move to a remote first workflow. So yeah, some interesting trends here.
Tim, I don't want to throw a curveball at you, but that production company number, has that remained relatively constant throughout our 4 surveys?
That's grown a little bit. On average, it typically is about 16 to 17%. The other one just below that, religious organizations, has also grown. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that, because you asked me to write an article around that trend. So it's interesting to see that we've got sportsbook and religion both growing, through this period of time. Now, Ryan, sorry, go ahead, Eric.
And what I think the commonality among all the industries that have grown is an emphasis on live streaming, right?
Correct.
And that kind of leads us into our next slide.
It does.
If I can get back to my PowerPoint screen, there we go.
Okay, so now this slide, we have asked this from the beginning, and we asked people, do you only create media? Do you only distribute media? Or do you both create and distribute media? You can see on here, create and distribute media is sitting at 73%. And I made some notes. If I go back to the late 2019, early 2020, only 46% of respondents at that point said they both created and distributed media. In that same period of time, where we've got only create media at 7%, it was actually 19% when we started this, and the only distribute media was at 20%. You can see it's only fallen a small amount, but essentially the not applicable has dropped, the only create media has dropped, and it really seems what we're seeing is a trend here of people saying, I not only want to just create the content, but I want to control the destiny of where it goes. Now, that could be as simple as somebody says, I'm going to put it on TikTok and on YouTube. So they're making distribution choices, but even more so from the sort of professional streaming industry, I believe what we're seeing is a number of companies stepping up and saying, we can do our own niche delivery solution. Obviously we're going to rely on a CDN or an OVP, but ultimately we're going to make the choice to create the content and distribute it. And Ryan, I'd be curious, I mean, you've been in the industry for quite some time. Have you seen this trend as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's part of a greater trend of content. That content used to be created by the very upper echelons of broadcast industry and production industry, right? And now everyone can be a content producer. So, and not just that, everyone wants to own their value when creating content as well. So you've seen the trend, obviously, with everyone coming out with an OTT app, right, in the last 5 years. And that's true of not just broadcasters who have gone away from maybe posting their content to Hulu and are owning their own OTT brand. Look at Disney Plus, right? And the growth they've had in just the last year. But even brands, someone like a Manchester United who now realize that they could only really monetize video and media through selling their rights to larger broadcasters, and usually the league would be in charge of those kind of things. Now Manchester United realizes that people want to engage with their actual club itself through their fan base, and they can monetize that, right? And so I think everyone who's become a creator has now also become their own distributor, and that is true of what you're just mentioning with this kind of TikTok culture, and that all started with creating your own YouTube apps and people monetizing that. But I think the more interesting trend that I think is going to happen is, instead of people giving away their value to YouTube and Spotify and TikTok, is how can I actually find the biggest way to retain that value? And I think media is becoming, especially the distribution of media, is becoming a lot more democratized. And I think a lot of people, even at the very niche level, with this kind of creator culture that we have and the gig economy culture, I think there's a lot of apps that I'm seeing where people want to monetize their knowledge of something. Are you into taking old Apple TVs and repurposing them for new use cases? There's a niche. There's 100 people in the world who might be interested in that subject, and they may be willing to pay premium to be able to access that content. That kind of gig economy culture, I think, is the next trend in the distribution of media specifically. And content creation tools have been there for a while, but the distribution piece, I think you can see a lot of people own that and white label that, and platforms that enable that gig economy culture.
And it's interesting, if we follow the trend of television, if you remember, in early television, shows were sponsored by companies. So JFG, Lawrence Welk was sponsored by Metamucil or something, I can't remember. But ultimately, we've had similar models in the streaming industry in the first probably 15 years, where you had niche content like what I'm doing. You would find somebody who would sponsor that and you'd put that up. But as you say now, that content may actually have a value that's latent that I wouldn't necessarily think about until I see how many people are watching it through the sponsorship model. And then say, okay, maybe I can transition that over into something that's a paid model. So that's a really good point, Ryan.
All right, I had to, of course, check, and it was Geritol that sponsored Lawrence Welk.
I knew it was something, but my grandparents always were like, "Oh yeah, I need to get some more of that." So.
But let's look now at some of the technical issues, resolution and bit rate. Tim, how has this changed, or what do you find here that's most interesting?
So two things I find most interesting. One is on the left-hand side, just how little 4K, when we look across the industry, clearly we've got the premium OTTs, like Ryan mentioned, Disney Plus, Netflix, Hulu, Amazon Prime, who are pushing content out in 4K. And there is no doubt that most content now is being acquired in 4K. But the fact that delivery is clearly still set in the 1080p low frame rate, 24, 25, 30, sort of just reminds us that, we as an industry talk about 4K and even 8K, but ultimately across the board, the sweet spot has moved from 720p to low end 1080p. And then from a bitrate standpoint, the 5 megabits per second, taking up about a third of this, a third of the total responses, and 8 megs taking up another 16%. So there, we've got a roughly half of it is between 5 and 8 megs. That has been a change in the US because it had traditionally been 3 to 5. Prior to the pandemic, it was fairly consistently 3 to 5. And I think as people have worked from home and consumed more content from home, the expectation is, if I'm going to watch 1080p, I really want to watch it at 1080p as opposed to just that being the pixel resolution. I want the quality to be there, and HDR obviously has had a big part to do with that as well. So to me, we haven't moved the needle as much on the average resolutions, but we've certainly moved the needle on average bit rate. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that our ISPs and last miles, have also upped their game during the pandemic as well.
So on that adaptive bit rate encoding ladder, those renditions that have always been sitting there are simply now being called more frequently than they were before.
That's a really good way to see it. Absolutely.
Yeah, the other part I would add to this is, I think we're actually going to see this almost stagnate in trends, because I think we're right on the cusp. We've obviously been talking about codecs. I won't go too deep into the codec battle and war between AV1 and H.265, but both of them lend themselves to not focusing as much on the bit rate or even the resolution, but being able to optimize the amount of quality you can do across the same bit rate, right? So I think with bit rates, I think we're going to see kind of them stay pretty consistent, but then the quality actually improve through things like HDR and 10-bit as these new codecs allow us to get into deeper features that we can't do with H.264.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, Ryan, the context-aware or content-aware encoding. The idea is keep the bit rate constant, but figure out what better quality I can give you within that particular bit rate. So good point.
Exactly.
Okay, so on this one, what's your organization's typical viewer or subscriber size? This gets a bit to what Ryan was talking about with niche, where you may have you may have content that is of value to certain people, but not necessarily on the large scale. Having said that, the needle has moved in this particular one, where before we were sort of dominant in the 1,001 to 10,000 viewers or subscribers per month. You can see that it's, the over 10,000 is pushed out. And in fact, we're going to be in the next survey that's coming out asking about even higher numbers. Now that the needle has moved up to that plus 10,000, we want to understand how many of those are, plus 100,000, how many of those are plus 1 million. My sense is we look at the next slide, and Eric, we can go ahead and go to that, which is around revenue. My sense is that for the majority of the market, we're still probably just over 10,000, still in 5 figures, not really over 100,000 for the average streaming solution out there. And obviously that sort of begs the question of revenues. And this one's been vexing to me. For every survey, we have high numbers in certain parts of the market. We have good numbers in the middle part of the market, but then we've got this absolutely massive down here at the bottom of the annual revenues. And I think there've been a couple interesting articles that have come out recently about how so many people who have tried to become social media influencers, even when they get 15 to 25,000 viewers, are only making $10 to $15 off of that particular model. So Ryan, to your point on content being more valuable and not giving the value away to YouTube, do you expect that we'll see even things like social media influencers sort of look for platforms that let them make more off of the followers that they have?
Yeah, I think so. In fact, I was at a venture conference this last week here in Bend, Oregon, where I live, in Pacific Northwest, and there was a local kind of Pacific Northwest venture conference, and there was a company presenting there called Portal that's based out of Eugene, Oregon, and they're trying to do that for content creators, specifically in the music industry. Because Spotify is quite notorious for the amount of how small of a margin they actually pay to the actual music creators or content creators. It's really quite disgusting how little of a margin they end up getting. So yeah, I think that's true. I think the social media generation, I think people have found a way to try to merge influencers into products. I think there's like this very cheap evolution that's happening right now that's not fully fledged, but I think it's going to become a much more polished model really in the end, as people try to find ways to monetize that. I think the other piece too is even kind of unique trends that are going to emerge from this. So a lot of times now, like there's products being created around kind of watch parties, where you're watching content, but you want to have your favorite not professional but amateur person calling your favorite sports team, and how you build in those products and how you reward those people through tipping or through things like that. Those kind of interactivity pieces I think are going to be quite interesting, with new ideas of how we can consume content. In Spain, when you watch like a Champions League game, you can actually pull in your favorite radio station in the audio feed with like Movistar or one of the local. In America, I really haven't seen that very much, where you can have your local announcer. If you're a Green Bay Packer fan, you can have your local Green Bay announcer who's going to add a lot more color. It's going to be a completely different experience through that audio channel. And I think people creating products around those things are going to find new ways of making content creators, really unique content creators, add a value to content that we haven't quite seen before, mixing it in with traditional streaming. So all these kind of concepts, I think, are going to really change a little bit, I think, what's traditional.
And that really plays to interactivity. And Eric, we want you to be the very first Green Bay Packers commentator, because,
well, we've already got, I was just going to say, Ryan, that would, then overcome the problem, or that would get rid of the phenomenon that we experience often of watching the game on television, but having the radio playing in the background instead, or through our stereo. But Cheesehead TV was one of the first sort of examples of what Ryan just described, which is Corey Benke and Aaron Nagler, who run LiveX, a production studio out of New York and now in Green Bay. They have watch parties for every Packer game. And, I'm not sure what their numbers are, but you're absolutely right. Those are passionate, engaged fans who tip, who subscribe to their Patreon. So clearly there's a market here for these new monetization models.
Exactly.
Nice. All right, now to one of Ryan's points where we see the trend of live, this frequency of live events and average concurrent viewers. Average concurrent viewers is actually something we've just started asking about. That's something that we saw as an oversight from earlier surveys to sort of understand peak models and concurrent models. But frequency of live events, this really goes to the education space, the houses of worship space, and even to the enterprise space, where we're seeing an uptick. The monthly numbers before had been much higher. The more than 5 times a week is sort of held consistent, but the 3 to 5 times per week has grown. I believe the first one of these we did, it was around 15%, and it's grown to where there's a higher frequency of live. And Ryan, to your point, sort of with the new models that people can do, especially with interactivity and low latency, as you talk about that trend of doing more live, what does that look like, even for things like social influencers, or people who wouldn't traditionally have done live? They would have recorded it ahead of time and then uploaded it.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that we've all been searching for this last couple of years, as the world's kind of become this new place, is human connection. And really, human connection you can only get through interaction that's live. So a lot of VOD content, obviously people are still consuming YouTube, they're still consuming video on demand services, but even these kind of OTT platforms that have added the watch together features, right? Through Disney Plus has done that. I know Hulu has done that. I believe Netflix has done that as well, or at least in a proof of concept around it, is the fact that you want to be able to do that, but then also interact with your family remotely, as we've not been able to get together. The watch together party situation that we just talked about. So the live events, I think, have just grown exponentially through all of these different verticals that we have. Zoom being one of the biggest receivers of that huge volume growth. But the reality is other people have tried to see other ways that they can consume or use live tools to be able to create that interactivity element. And the frequency at which we do this has become more and more apparent. I think the other interesting trend here is, I think people have tried to replace professional grade workflows with consumer grade equipment. So instead of being able to be on site and be able to use professional equipment to live stream, we've all had to use the browser or these tools as our default de facto method to stream with, which has democratized live streaming. I think 2 years ago you talk about some very basic video streaming concepts to the vast majority of the world, and people's eyes would glaze over. I think everyone now has become a live producer, a live streamer, is familiar with how to make themselves look good on camera. That's going to start a huge trend, and it has started a huge trend, that's going to make the frequency of live events so much higher.
So when I started in video conferencing, we had this concept, and this was 25 years ago, where you would do low resolution for the talking heads, high resolution for your graphics. And we did that because we had a limited amount of bandwidth. And you mentioned watch parties, where essentially the high quality content focus is on what we're actually watching, and the low quality is focused on the talking heads. You'd mentioned before, Ryan, too, that there's a similar model that Millicast has in the in sort of the high-end media industry. Talk a little bit about that with doing dailies and workflows.
Yeah, so just to give you a couple of examples, we pretty much have every major Hollywood studio that has either built their own product or is using Millicast through a third-party product to do remote production. So this could be anything from pre-production to live production to post-production workflows for TV shows, commercial shoots, films, all of it. And in those situations, really, you care about, if you're doing a color grading for a post-production, you care about the high quality content, right? And you want that to be 10 megabit per second HDR, 10-bit, 4K. Pull that up on your Apple TV, but you still want to have the interactivity element where the director, the producer, the color grader are all there and can talk to each other and see each other. Kind of like we're doing now in Zoom, at least my interface here, I've got the talking heads, we've got the audio element, that adds the interactivity piece, but really what we care about is the main content on screen. So finding that kind of balance in between the two is I think, huge, where you need to make sure that you've got the resiliency, right, of that kind of high quality stream, but still the low latency interactivity of the talking heads. And building products to do that is quite difficult. And then so many companies now, look, Zoom's a great product. It's obviously filled a huge niche for what we've needed the last couple of years, but people want to own their own brand. They want a white label. They want to also not be responsible for using a cloud-based product. They want to own their own kind of infrastructure and security. So I think all of those things put together has seen this emergence of all these different live streaming tools. And specific to WebRTC, it's a protocol that really allows us to add all those pieces of high quality, low latency, security that has made it very easy for people to build products on tools like Twilio Live and Red 5 and even Wowza's new real-time streaming product and Millicast and Agora and many others.
And the beauty of being also codec agnostic from the standpoint of being able to, not all streams are created equal, as you say, low res for talking heads, high res for this. Speaking of interactivity, Eric, we're going to have to click along on these because we want to get to the slides on that. Let me just briefly on this particular slide, just make one comment or two comments. When we first started asking companies this question, which is basically, what do you provide services for? Houses of worship has grown 43% over the period of time that we've done this, and education has grown almost 70% in terms of what's being served. So while we have live events here as a grouping, I would argue that what's grown in the houses of worship and the education is actually the live portion of that as well, because this is not for on-demand content. This is for delivery of real-time lectures, real-time sermons, what have you. We can go ahead and go on to the next slide. Now here, from the highest or lowest, and one reason I keep harping on social influencers is you can clearly see that from the business model of what's provided as we look at live, and again, excluding what houses of worship do and what education does, live UGC has pushed forward. When we first started this, concerts and major sporting events were at the top of the list. Live UGC was at the bottom of the list. And in the last 18 to 19 months, this is reversed. And I think it goes to some of the points that Ryan's made. Obviously, sports is still important, but what's interesting is the constants in here are business and social influencers, where the uncertains in terms of business being offered is the sporting side. I don't know if you want to add anything on this, Ryan, or just go on to the interactivity slides.
No, it's interesting. I think this slide among all of them is probably one that surprises me the most as the trend in the industry. And people, I think, especially with streaming media, right, as an organization, I think you guys have seen probably an evolution of the type of people that your publication and your website is attracting. And I think the UGC community, like I said, is getting deeper and deeper into the complexities of video streaming and want to own that and make it professional. And I think this trend kind of proves that out.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and so the one last thing I would say on it, and Eric, you can stay on this slide, but the one last thing I'd say is when we do the report, we'll actually spell out from an analysis standpoint the trend of those, because I think that slide is a very intriguing slide. Okay, now when you're talking about how you deal with challenges in video service, which challenges are the biggest? Clearly, we've got the issues of video quality. Buffering's dropped away. Latency is actually one of those that's very high. And Ryan, this walks beautifully into the next set of slides around what you all are doing with interactivity. So Eric, let's go ahead and go to the next slide here. So we ask people, when they look at the kinds of interactivity they're going to offer, either they offer now or plan to offer in the next 18 months. Ryan's mentioned watch parties, but this few to many model of sort of 2 or 3 people as talk show hosts or doing conference presentations, and then everybody else watches it as a traditional stream, it comes out on top. In fact, when I did a review of Wowza's real-time streaming at scale, this was one of the things that even the Wowza mentioned to me, is we see this as sort of a few to many world for a period of time. Obviously, we've got the Zooms, which are like what we're doing now, but how many people truly need to interact on it versus just having a few people interacting and then everybody else participating through some form of, say, text or chat or polling interactivity versus through video. Ryan, I'm going to turn over to you on this because I know this is an area that you're very passionate about.
Yeah, and even more than being passionate about it, it's also just catering to the trends that we've seen over the last couple of years. I think the few to many approach, I think the hybrid events have been huge for this. You guys being a great example, with streaming media, you guys have been relying on Zoom to do this virtually and be able to capture the value and the revenue that you have in the industry to stay alive as an organization. I think everyone is going through this who's trying to figure out what to do about their live event structure. And it's been horrible to be in that industry. And I feel for you guys and everyone else who tries to monetize out of trying to produce live events. NAB that we all usually go to this year, right? The National Association of Broadcaster event in Vegas canceled, I think it was like 3 weeks before. We have IBC coming up in Amsterdam that, who knows, may cancel. It's like a month away. But how do you create a product and the engagement through this few to many products? The reality is, Zoom and Teams and like all these different products, they're great for what they do, but they really are missing a lot of the components that we truly want in a hybrid event. And I think you're going to get more and more innovation that comes out of the general industry at large that is going to cater to this. And people want to own their brands. So there's a company I've been kind of talking to and working with called Eventual out of LA that comes from a production company called Addison Interactive that's been in the live production space. When a big Hollywood studio does a big premiere, they will go and they'll produce it and they'll do everything live and all that. Well, they're trying to bring that same concept of extremely high Hollywood quality live events to a hybrid workflow, and they're building a product around this. And I think there's a huge proliferation that they're very specific to a niche, and there's other kind of verticals that are getting this kind of hybrid event, but they want to own their own workflow and they want to own their own experience. And I think trying to build on top of a white label solution to do that is important. The other part I'll add here is, with all of these, when trying to add interactivity, the previous slide is a really good example. I think those of us that have been in the streaming industry for a while, especially since we've been dealing with HTTP streaming protocols like Apple HLS, we've had to, there's this famous triangle that we've seen with different streaming vendors that there's latency, quality, and scale, and you have to give up one to be able to have the other. And I think that triangle is pretty much becoming obsolete with some of the real-time streaming products you're seeing out in the market, where you can have extremely high quality, extremely low sub-second latency, and extremely large scale. And I don't want to focus all of this on WebRTC, but WebRTC is now filling this need where it's had this reputation for not being a technology that can scale to large audiences. And there's a lot of vendors out there, including Millicast, that have now cracked the code on how to scale that while still retaining extremely high quality and low latency. And that particular inversion of that triangle is really what fits nicely into all these different verticals that it's now allowed all of these use cases to build products on top of it. So I think that's quite interesting. The other, so another really interesting customer here is Megaphone TV. If you guys know of Megaphone in the industry, they've been adding interactivity products for quite a while, all around this kind of the one at the bottom here, non-video interactivity, which is Q&A, polls and quizzes, adding it to a live stream. So if like Bravo TV, you vote in on Top Chef on who's your favorite chef, right? The fans' choice, they have a product and they work with Bravo on adding all those interactivity elements. They're now building products that can fill not just the need of this non-video interactivity, but all the other things that are on this scale. So more and more, I think we're seeing an enormous evolution of trying to fill the need of those previous features inside of these different use cases.
And I'll add one other thing here on the few to many sort of hybrid conferences. Back, showing my age, back around the time of 9/11, of course, everything came to a halt stateside, for a period of a couple of weeks. And there was a lot of talk around this, but because it was only about a 6 to 8 week period of time, we still had companies saying, I'm going to postpone my event as opposed to I have to cancel it altogether. They were very concerned back at that point with, I don't want to cannibalize the live show by having this. We heard some of that early on in the pandemic where companies were like, I'll just push it out for 4 or 5 months, but I'm still going to do the live show. I think the reality has set in that this doesn't cannibalize the shows. This actually keeps the shows alive until such a time as we can do in-person events, whether they're fully in person or whether they're in person and hybrid as well.
Well, and it also, it also reflects a trend and a realization that's happened within the live music industry where, and to some degree live sports, right? Where something that in retrospect seems quite obvious has become clear, and that's no matter what the event is, there will always be more people who want to attend than are able to attend, whether for financial reasons, for reasons of travel, whatever the case might be. And so yes, does the risk remain of some people deciding they'll stay home rather than attend in person if you offer a hybrid event? Sure. But that's more than offset by the people who wouldn't have even considered attending the event in person, but who now can access it one way or another.
Yeah, like Manchester United has 600 million fans around the world. Do you think you can fit 600 million fans inside of Old Trafford? It's right. Like, so if you go and attain even $1 of value from each of these fans for every game, like Manchester United would be one of the biggest companies in the world, if not the biggest. Like, just put that into perspective, right? It's quite interesting. I see a question here from Joseph as well, where he's talking a little bit about whitelist solutions. I mentioned a few. All I'd recommend is if you're looking to build, is look for someone who allows you to build on an API. Millicast is one of them. I mentioned quite a few in the list. I don't know if there's an exhaustive list out there, to be honest, but it would be interesting to do some research. And I know Twilio just launched their Twilio Live, which is also a WebRTC product with an API. Wowza has their API that you can build on. There's quite a few out there.
As a matter of fact, we'll get to a couple slides down here where we'll list out 9 or so. All right, Eric, let's go on to the next slide. Okay, this slide we talk about stages, and this is something that's important as we sort of gauge the industry to say, at what stage are you in terms of looking at interactivity? And as we can see here, we have about 30% that are in the planning stage, another 20% that have done interactive pilots, so that's roughly 50%. And then about 20% who feel like they've got full interactive integration. That leaves another roughly 30% that say, look, we haven't gone that way. We're still thinking about the possibility of it. Maybe we don't have the education or the information enough. And in fact, this proves out in another question that we asked, that a number of these people in this sort of stage 0 are saying, we just don't know enough about it. Ryan, in a minute or less, what would you tell these people as they're sort of looking at trying to decide whether they put interactivity into their streaming solutions?
I think, yeah, it's hard to kind of summarize because there's so many different people attending today that come from different verticals, and interactivity means different things to different people. Let me just kind of boil it down to what the common thread is, which is usually real-time or close to real-time streaming is really one of the caveats of being able to deliver an interactive experience. I think specific to WebRTC, it has been traditionally very hard to deploy and scale and manage on your own. I think there's a lot of platforms now that allow you to go to market very quickly, using someone else's knowledge and experience in their architecture, that you can reduce your capital expenditures with having to find professionals and hire a team and scale that and become pretty much a live streaming provider, which is always the worst idea when you just want to focus on your vertical and your SaaS product. So there's a lot more, I think, options here for people to go to market very quickly. That may be the reason we see such high numbers in stage 0 and stage 1, which is we've not taken the plunge because we feel like it's very daunting, and that's true. So yeah, I think that reduces a little bit the risk and be able to launch a quick proof of concept and go to market with it.
Good. All right, on to the next slide, Eric. So here we said, what are the key criteria in looking for an interactive service provider? These are not much different than looking for a standard, online video service provider. Reliability, far and away. And Ryan, I think you sort of touched on that WebRTC traditionally, when compared to RTMP, say, the question was whether it could scale. And a lot of that was because WebRTC, even though it's based on older technologies, the combination of those technologies is new, and getting content delivery networks to work on that. Price obviously is a big issue, and then device support. And I think this goes, you talked about some of the APIs, SDKs, but given the fact that the majority of content could be consumed in low latency models on mobile devices, how does that play into the whole mix, Brian?
Yeah, so let me start with price, because I think that's really interesting. I think when you look to build on someone else's architecture, obviously the price is going to go up because it takes away the risk of having to build it out yourself. The interesting thing about when we've tried to focus very much this keynote on interactivity. When you look at price, like with Millicast, for example, we have per gigabit pricing that, compared to a traditional CDN like Akamai or others, it's 3-4x the cost. Yet our average price to our customers for the value of interactivity is 100 to 150x the value. So they're building products that are charging $1 a gigabyte, for which is ridiculous when you think about CDNs are down in the 1.5 cent, 2 cent as far as their cost. Yet people are building products with interactivity that people are willing to pay $1 per gigabit for. And you could extrapolate that to the amount of time based. My point is the fact that there's a value to interaction that isn't the traditional cost model that we've had inside of CDNs and streaming. That part is hard for a lot of us to wrap our heads around who've been in the live streaming industry for a little bit or for a long time. And the fact that gigabits and bandwidth has become commoditized. It's just become this one thing that we just go and look for the biggest vendor, like buying gas, your ExxonMobil or Shell, and you go to buy gas from the biggest, the lowest price in the market. That's pretty much what CDNs have become, when in fact we're losing sight of what the real value is and what we're trying to do. Bandwidth is really not the issue. It's the interactivity piece. So I think that part's interesting. Reliability is also a big one. So with reliability, WebRTC and other RTC technologies are built on UDP, where you prioritize latency over resiliency. Meaning, if you don't have enough bandwidth in a given millisecond, it's going to drop packets because it's more important to deliver at sub 500, 200 milliseconds than it is to make sure all the packets get there. Something like SRT is really trying to make TCP work like UDP. It's trying to, extrapolate or get the latency piece of it, but still not lose the packets. So, and then, SRT is a good contribution protocol, but it's not a distribution protocol that's web native, which gets us to like the wide device support piece of this. The nice thing about WebRTC is it's a web standard, and web is the primary way that we're all contributing and distributing as far as encode and decode media in this modern world. We have to go through the web for all of it. And a lot of traditional broadcasters, kind of maybe roll their eyes at this, where they're used to their own TV head-ends or going through satellite or going through their own encode decode model. Well, that encode decode model is not a 50,000 rack mounted, harmonic encoder now. It is your web browser. And it's going to continue to be, and it's going to become even more so. So having wide device support that uses an IETF and W3 standard, which are the two governing bodies of the internet and the web, is really key to making sure that whatever is the trend with streaming and streaming media, especially for live and real-time content, is web native. And I think WebRTC is well placed for that.
And I would add one other thing that's not on the list here. I'm going to put my greening of streaming hat on for a moment. The other thing is sort of the power consumption. Ryan, you mentioned you don't need the 50,000 units sitting there. So that's a power consumption savings, but obviously we've got significantly high battery usage when we're doing video on mobile devices. One of the areas we're going to look at, that we've looked at in the past with Flash Media Player, is what the power impact is on it. It's sort of uncertain in the industry at this point, but given the fact that it's in the web browser, have you all done any studies around whether or not power consumption is lower for that versus launching a separate player or separate app that somebody has to use?
I mean, obviously, we're doing things on our mobile phones now that you couldn't do with a server that fits inside of a city block, right? Like 30, 40 years ago. I think that's true of everything that we're doing. I say this bold statement when I talk about WebRTC and AV1 and some of the kind of more modern codecs, is in 5 years' time, maybe at the very most 10 years' time, I don't think there'll be a hardware encoder in the world. Everything will be done in software. Everything will be done, whether it's a browser wrapper or in software, it will be done, I think, through the browser. And yeah, so obviously there's a much lower power consumption, and most of those workflows have still only been done in software, which is a huge resource savings. Even the way our WebRTC technology works, it's a multiplexer. It doesn't actually do any transcoding. There is no ABR that we do at the origin level, so it means you need less resources in the cloud. So to that point, Tim, yeah, I think there's an obvious savings there, and that's the evolution of the industry.
Okay. Now on to I mentioned we were going to have a couple slides with different companies. This particular question was a question that I was really intrigued to understand responses from the industry. What we're seeing here is the deep purple is I'm not familiar with your company, and the dark gray is I actively use your solution. Now, in these particular companies, these are the sort of fully interactive many-to-many, so Zoom, Teams, Google Meet, WebEx. You can see on here, to the point that we talked about earlier, that Zoom clearly is actively used across the board. What surprised me sort of on this slide is Google Meet was as low as it is, mainly because of the fact that it's a Google product. I would have expected it to be a bit higher, but it's not that far off from WebEx. I'm just going to open up really quickly. Ryan, do you have any comments on this before we jump to the remaining parts of this question?
Yeah, I just think, these are obviously tools that are fitting a very, very needed feature, which is real-time communication, right? These are all traditional real-time communication tools. They're not really live event tools. The interface that I'm in right now on my Mac is pretty ugly. Like, how do I control the branding? How do I control the look and feel? How do I add interactivity features beyond standard real-time communication tools? I think all these vendors fit a need. I just don't think they allow for people to go and launch their own white label solutions in the market that are fitting these new kind of emerging use cases.
Fair point. All right, Eric, the next slide then. So here we have, thank you. Here we have a few more companies in the space. Wowza, obviously, as a brand, is very heavily used, and interestingly, it's actually more used than WebEx, which I found really quite intriguing. Millicast actually ranks about in the middle of this. We've got Theos Hesp, NanoCosmos, LiveSwitch. Ryan, do these numbers surprise you in terms of sort of being consistent across the board, with active use for interactive being fairly low in the industry?
Yeah, and I'll just throw out there that obviously it's not an exhaustive list. You know, we have a question here that talks about Ant Media, and there's obviously other ones in the market. And so let me just kind of touch on some of these. Wowza obviously is a traditional player. We're pretty much the first agnostic media server out there that really filled the need of, with one server being able to do what you need three for, right? Like the real player server or real server and Windows Media Server and Flash Media Server. You can do it all in one, in addition to having support for HTTP streaming. And they're now playing in the WebRTC space as well. Nanocosmos as well, you know, is kind of in that space. But yeah, I mean, Wowza has been around now for 15 plus years. So they're obviously the most well-known name in the industry, have a very loyal fan base.
So Eric, let's go ahead and skip the next slide, you know, which essentially had another grouping of these companies, and go to this, these last few slides. Organizations' time frame for offering interactivity. This one sort of surprised me, Ryan, because as you say, interactivity means different things to different people. And we have this really large group who say, yeah, we've already implemented interactivity. And yet if you go back to the phase 0, phase 1, it's clear that when we're talking about the video portion of interactivity, that's still not nearly close to what this already implemented percentage is. The uncertain looking for more information, as I mentioned before, that one's you know, about 20%. So to me, there's education on two levels in the industry. One is, what is interactivity? What does it mean to you? And then the second is, what do you need to know to make that particular leap? And then let's see, just what is your take on this, Ryan?
Yeah, I think it goes back to the question we had earlier, which is what does interactivity mean to you and for your market? And a lot of that can be done through traditional tools, you know, adding a chat feature or a Q&A or a poll feature. A lot of it, when it comes to true video interactivity, I think there's a lot of people who really haven't built a lot of products around this. So it's not a big surprise that a lot of people, not many, have actually, you know, gone deep into this already.
Okay. And then Eric, is the next slide our last slide?
That was our last slide.
Okay. Did we have there may have been a slide that we missed in here. I may have failed to put it in, but there was a question that I think Ryan and I should talk about briefly, which is the expectation of interactivity. And I think the expectation of interactivity, when we ask the question about, do you expect 1 second or lower? Do you expect 1 to 3 seconds, or do you expect more than 3 seconds in terms of interactivity? I think, Ryan, we talked briefly about RTMP and how RTMP has been out there, and it sort of has been one of those protocols that everybody sort of said, okay, fine, it's going to take us 1 to 3 seconds. We get to HLS and it takes us 30 seconds. So clearly that doesn't work for interactivity. And WebRTC, as you said, sort of gears toward going down into the sub 1 second. What's your take on the fact that about roughly half the people said 1 to 3 seconds was acceptable? Is that just because they're used to RTMP and don't know what WebRTC can do?
Potentially, and I think it all comes down to defining true video interactivity, which is a question that we have here, for panelists. For me, true video interactivity needs to be at the very most sub 500 milliseconds for us to be able to see each other, there not be a delay. It create actual engagement and conversation. It needs to be natural, like we're there in person. You can't do that with 1 to 3 seconds. That fits a lot of use cases and a lot of needs, but the reality is it has to be, I think, under half a second, if not even better than that. And to kind of finish off on how do you achieve that? We have a question here from Joseph talking about getting maybe an open source WebRTC platform and trying to deploy it yourself. You can do that, and there's so many our own solution is built. Our CTO built a open source solution, and our own solution is built on that. But it's not trivial. It's not trivial to scale. It's not trivial to launch that in the market on different cloud vendors, manage it. Do you want to be a real-time streaming provider, or do you want to go build your solution and not have to worry about the infrastructure layer? I think that's true across streaming, and it was true with the RTMP days when you had to go and manage your own Origin Edge network with your own RTMP servers. Do you do that, or do you go use a vendor that already has that solution and allows you to integrate very simply with an API? So those are the questions you have to answer, and I can't answer that for you. It depends on how quick you want to get to market and how much money you want to spend, and if you want to be up at nights managing your own infrastructure.
Fair enough.
Right.
All right,
Eric,
Eric.
there are a couple other. Sorry, Tim. There are a couple other questions that have come in through the Q&A. Unfortunately, we do have to wrap, but I can save those questions and forward them to you, Ryan, and you can get back to the attendees who had questions about specific things. Tim and Ryan, any parting words?
I would say, I think it's really interesting to see how interactivity has raised the bar on what we expect from a streaming standpoint during the pandemic. And I think Ryan's point is really well taken. We want that connectivity, which is why things like watch parties, and it's not just one company out there doing it. Every company that I know of is sort of moving to add that service, because it's not enough just to watch the movie and talk to your friends. You want to be able to actually interact with them while it's going on. Ryan?
Yeah, I'll make a quick reference. I have one of my favorite customers right now is called Portal Hologram. So PORTL hologram. And pretty much what it allows you to do is actually see someone, like pretty much have a hologram of yourself halfway across the world. It's interesting as to where that's going, and are we going to create this kind of Princess Leia video message in real time, you know, to create this interactivity remotely. I think we're actually there. Like, we're there as far as a technology stack, and we're there as the web has really evolved into this new evolution of streaming media, and I think that's quite exciting.
That's a great place to wrap. Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Ryan. As the last slide of the PowerPoint did mention, there will be a full research report coming out sometime this month. Lord willing and the creek don't rise. And we'll also make this PowerPoint available to attendees. But the full report with more analysis and more slides will come out later this month. Thanks again for joining. We will be back in just a little under a half hour with our first panel of the day. A look at the question of subscription fatigue and whether or not there are just too darn many OTT services. So hope to see some of you then. Thanks again.